Good morning and welcome to this week's View on Africa. My name is Omar Mahmoud. I'm a senior researcher in the ISS office in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And for this session this week, I want to discuss one of our recent publications, which looks at the regional implications of Sudan after Bashir. So I think this is an important topic and one in which the research report is available on our website. But when we're looking at Sudan and the transformation that's going on right now, it's clear that Bashir's overthrow was predicated by domestic concerns. These of course, relate to the economy and also political grievances. But I think it's also clear that Bashir's overthrow will resonate throughout the region. And there's a few factors for this, or a few reasons for this. One, Bashir himself was very much involved externally outside of Sudan's borders. This often took the form of external meddling, followed by, at times, peacemaking when it suited his interest. So in this sense, Sudan, and especially Sudan under Bashir, was very active externally throughout the region. So now you've removed that element and there's a bit of a vacuum. Secondly, of course, this is another major contextual shock in the Horn of Africa, in a region that's undergone a number of major shocks over the past 2 years that's really upset a status quo. You can talk about the political changes that were going on in Ethiopia, the rapprochement between Ethiopia and Eritrea, the emergence of some other sorts of either integration aspects or even new insecurity dynamics as well. But over the past 2 years, there's been a number of changes in the Horn, which have really upset the status quo, and the fall of Bashir in Sudan is another one of those. And the third aspect, I think, which makes this important is because the removal of Bashir also allows for external actors to become involved internally in Sudan in a way that they weren't really able to, or weren't really doing so much before. Essentially, the removal of Bashir removes a check on some of that process. So you have a vacuum within the region in terms of Bashir being gone, and then you also have the greater involvement of the region, but also the wider region in Sudan as well. And I think it's important to point out that it's not just necessarily the removal of Bashir himself, but the removal of the people around him that also had some of these regional relationships and that were very active in this regard. So I think with that introduction, it kind of frames the impetus or the focus of that paper and the research. And so I'll just touch on a few of the regional relationships I think that are important to look into, because it's good to have an analysis and an understanding of some of these issues now, given the ongoing changes. In the first regional dynamic I think we should look at is that which relates to South Sudan. Now, of course, in South Sudan, we now have the revitalized Arxis agreement, and Bashir and Sudan played a major role in getting South Sudan to that place at the end of last year, and to the point where Sudan serves as one of the guarantors of that agreement, with Uganda as well. Well, now you've removed Bashir from the system. What does that mean for South Sudan and the peace agreement going forward? Well, first of all, it does leave a bit of a vacuum, especially given that the other guarantor is Uganda itself, and has been seen to be very close to the Kiir administration at various times over the past few years. So there needs to be some sort of rebalancing there as well. This could mean a greater role for some other member states, IGAD member states. We've seen Kenya in particular stepping up some of their engagement, which might be trying to facilitate or play into that vacuum. This could mean a greater role for the international organizations, for IGAD, for the AU as well. But I think the key point to make is that with Bashir being gone and with a new government there being likely very much inwardly focused over the initial part of their tenure, This leaves a bit of a balance or a vacuum in South Sudan at a time that's very critical for that agreement. There's already been a 6-month extension of the pre-transitional period, which is set to expire in November. A lot of talk about whether some of the key aspects of that agreement are really being put into place, and so it's a very fragile time for that as well. And so this contextual shock continues there. I think the relationship with Chad is another interesting aspect. Chad and Sudan under Bashir and Deby, who's been the president and leader in Chad for a long time, had a very complicated relationship, which was at times quite adversarial. But following an agreement in 2010 to avoid internal interference in each other's affairs, that border dynamic between them very much became improved at a state-to-state level. Now, the underlying grievances of why that border area is insecure and why non-state armed actors emerge out of that area wasn't really resolved. But at least at a state-to-state level, this competition in supporting each other's proxy elements was significantly reduced. And so the removal of Bashir, I think, led to significant questions on part of Chad in terms of, will this new government respect this agreement we've had thus far over the border area and over non-interference in each other's affairs, first of all. And then secondly, it also brings some interesting questions with regards to Chad in terms of some of the new leadership in Khartoum and some of that which comes from the border area as well. And what does that mean for the future of Chad-Sudan relations? And so I think developments thus far have shown a preference to continue the status quo, but given the prevailing insecurity dynamics, I think this is another area very much to keep on top of and to be watching going forward. The third key regional aspect I'd point out is the relationship with Ethiopia and Eritrea vis-a-vis Sudan. And this has always been a very interesting triangle in terms of when relations with two are good, the third is usually not, and it seesawed a little bit through these dynamics. And in particular, prior to Bashir's overthrow, we saw the border with Sudan and Eritrea was closed. And it was very unclear the reasons for this, whether that had to deal with local smuggling concerns, trafficking concerns, or whether it was tied to some of these more international disputes with regards to the GCC crisis and whatnot. The explanation for that was never quite clear, but the impact was. This led to deterioration of relations between Sudan and Eritrea. And this happened at a very interesting time when Ethiopia and Eritrea were increasing relations as part of this rapprochement that we've seen last year. And so you saw Ethiopia and Eritrea using that as a springboard to talk about greater integration, economic integration in the Horn of Africa and involving Somalia and some of these other countries. But one key country that was left out of this really was Sudan. And so it begged the question to what degree the negative relations between Bashir and Afwerki at that point led to Sudan not being part of that discussion, and whether his removal now maybe opens up an opportunity to bring Sudan into this wider regional economic integration discussion. And so I think we've seen big involvement from both Ethiopia and Eritrea in Sudan post-Bashir. Ethiopia, of course, was one of the key leaders behind the mediation that's got us to this power-sharing agreement between the civilian protest movement and the military right now. And with Eritrea, there's been a number of high-level visits back and forth between officials in Khartoum and officials in Asmara. And so it signaled very much a reinvigoration of that relationship. Now, the interesting question is, to what degree do Ethiopia and Eritrea's future vision of Sudan diverge a little bit in terms of some of the support we've seen in some of the agreements? We saw Ethiopia very much working with the African Union in a coordinated effort to come to an agreement between the military and the protesters, while at the same time we saw Eritrea being very critical of the AU's approach to Sudan. So it comes back to this triangle where when relations with two sides of that triangle improve, the third one declines. And so now we see Eritrea and Ethiopia both engaging in Sudan, but what does that mean for the future of the Ethiopia-Eritrea relationship, and whether there are different visions of that future there. So another key aspect to look at. With regards to the regional aspect, one other thing I think I'd point out is something I mentioned at the beginning, and now with Bashir being removed, we have not only the lack of his involvement externally, but we have the greater involvement of the region internally within Sudan. This is clear within the mediation dynamic and the role Ethiopia played in that. But there's also another key element here, and that is Sudan's internal agreement with some of its rebel groups and non-state armed actors. And in this new government, in this new power sharing dynamic, there's been a priority in the first 6 months in terms of coming to an internal agreement. Now, there's already been some discussions to that, but also some contestation over that. But one key interesting dynamic you see now is the region leveraging some of their connections with some of these groups to play host, to play the role of mediator in a way that's very much flipped from what was happening earlier. So you have meetings going on in Addis Ababa, you have meetings going on in Juba and South Sudan trying to position itself with some of the groups. Chad's done the same under Deby, and even Egypt in Cairo. So you have at one point an opportunity for some of these nations to be playing that role now in Sudan, but there's also concerns about maybe coordination and competition within that, especially given that this will be such a priority going forward. Moving on from the region, I think the second aspect we were talking about was the greater involvement externally within Sudan now that there's a check gone in Bashir. And I won't highlight all of those elements, but one thing I'll just touch on that I think is emblematic of this relates to the Gulf cooperation crisis, which broke out on the Gulf side a few years ago and pit Saudi Arabia and the UAE more or less against Qatar and by association Turkey as well, and how that played out in the Horn. Well, Bashir was very much able to play off both sides. You saw him agreeing to deploy troops for the war effort in Yemen, the Saudi Arabia-UAE war effort in Yemen, and at the same time you saw him engage Turkey and Qatar to rebuild the port of Suakin, this ancient port on the Red Sea coast. So you saw him very much being able to draw from both sides, which worked quite well for some time, up until really the time of his departure, when I think there's maybe a bit of annoyance from both sides over his double dealing, and led in part to his inability to get the support he needed at that moment. But at any rate, the removal of him in Sudan also removes a bit of a check on this. And so there's the potential for Sudan to become the site of some of these proxy battles that we've seen elsewhere in the Horn. Thus far, I think we've really seen the ascendance of the Saudi Arabia-UAE bloc in this internal dynamic, and not so much pushback maybe from the Turkey-Qatar side. But I think one thing I would caution, and one thing we should look at going forward, is the short-term gains don't necessarily always translate into long-term stasis. So I think we'd have to very much be cognizant of this going forward. And in a few of the other countries, especially in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, we saw one of these sides emerge with a bit stronger hand, only to be undermined later on. And so the main point being that the removal of Bashir and the institution of this new power sharing agreement removes that check, and so there could be greater influence and jockeying between competitive influence in Sudan going forward as well. So I think I'd more or less leave it there. There's more details in the report that's on our website, which looks at really the regional implications, but just driving home the point that in this transition and in a government that's likely to be inwardly focused on the economy and in terms of ensuring domestic peace, there's a removal, a bit of a vacuum within the region, but also then greater influence within Sudan as well that we should be tracking going forward. So I thank you again for tuning in to this week's View on Africa, and encourage you to go to the website to see more details in our report that we put out recently on this topic. Thank you very much, and hope to see you again next time.